There is a leather-bound ledger sitting in a county archive in northern Georgia, and nobody is quite sure what to do with it. It was discovered in the floorboards of an abandoned house in 1962, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath the rotting joists. The pages are stained brown, the handwriting is cramped and precise, and it contains the names of 127 children born between 1875 and 1889, who the state of Georgia has no record of ever existing. What happens when a midwife's records show more births than the county ever knew about? When every child in that ledger was legally registered, witnessed, and documented, but then never seen again? This is the story of how one woman became the keeper of debts no one was supposed to collect. Rural Georgia in the 1870s and 80s had no doctors in the mountain hollows. The nearest physician was 16 miles away, accessible only if you had a horse and money and the kind of illness that could wait 3 days for a visit. Most people living in these ridges didn't have any of those things, so they relied on a midwife instead. She held a unique kind of power because she was the only person who stood between a woman and death during childbirth. For a woman in these isolated communities, midwifery was the only trade that offered real authority. She didn't need a man's permission or a formal education, but she did need her hands, her knowledge, and a willingness to go out in the dark and come back with a baby. That was enough to make her indispensable to the families in the hollow, and it was also enough to make her feared. This particular woman had been delivering babies in the county for nearly 15 years by the time anyone started keeping records about her at all. Her name appeared in whispers more than in conversation, and families who could afford to pay her well did so without asking any questions. Families who couldn't pay in cash found other ways the bill, often offering a length of cloth, a month of labor, or a claim to land that might not have been theirs to give. She collected these debts the way a bank collects money, and those debts were hers to keep. She was respected because she was necessary, and a woman in labor will find a midwife, regardless of the law or local regulations. But she was feared because nobody really knew what happened inside her house during those long deliveries. The house sat back from the main road, with windows covered by heavy cloth, and families went in carrying women and came out carrying infants until the transaction was complete. The midwife kept the records, she set the price, and she decided what happened next. In a county with no courthouse and no clerk, she was the only person who maintained a written registry of births. That ledger was her authority, and when the circuit judge came through once a year, she could show him the names and dates to prove her work. His authority rested entirely on her word, because without that ledger, there were no births and no people. The babies existed because she said they existed. The economics of rural birth worked in her favor, since these were rarely cash transactions. A family paid in trade goods they had on hand, like tobacco, corn, or chickens, while others paid in labor by committing to work her land for months after the birth. Some even paid in land claims, giving her scraps of property they barely understood the boundaries of. These debts moved slowly through the community, like a shadow currency, and the midwife was the creditor who everyone eventually owed. By the early 1880s, respect and fear had separated like oil and water. Respect is something you can hide, but fear makes people talk, and neighbors were starting to notice that the children she delivered seemed to disappear at a high rate. The gap was small at first and easy to dismiss as a tragedy of the mountains, but it was widening quietly, and it would soon become impossible to ignore. In 1883, a circuit judge named William Horton arrived in the county for his quarterly session, and his job was to establish the formal, vital records the state demanded, but nobody had been keeping. He was tasked with documenting births, deaths, and marriages, and he went about his work with a thoroughness that made the local families feel more than a little uncomfortable. Horton went house to house, pulling out the midwife's registry and sitting down to compare her handwritten notes against what he could verify from the parents directly. The discrepancy appeared on page 3. Over the 5-year span, from 1878 to 1883, the Midwife's registry showed 47 births. But when Horton interviewed the families she claimed to have served, the numbers didn't add up. When he counted the children he could actually see and verify as living, the total only came to 31, which meant 16 children were accounted for in a ledger but were missing from the world. Nearly a third of her recorded deliveries were simply absent. He asked her about it directly, and her answers came smoothly, the way someone gives answers they have already prepared for a long time. She spoke of stillbirths, infant fevers, milk sickness, and complications from the birth itself, and all of it sounded plausible enough to be true. In an era when 1 in 4 children never made it to their 5th birthday, her explanations fit the world as it was, especially since a fever could kill in 2 days without anyone understanding why. But Horton was a methodical man, so he looked for physical evidence, like graves or cemetery markers, to back up her claims. He found almost nothing, except for a few scattered graves in family plots, maybe 3 or 4 he could connect to her registry. But there were no mass graves or sections marked for infant loss. No family accounts of proper burials with witnesses existed, leaving only the midwife's word against the total absence of any way to verify the truth in either direction. It should have ended there, but a year later, a schoolteacher named Sarah Pritchard noticed something else that didn't sit right. Pritchard had been keeping a roster of students by family name for 6 years, and when she cross-referenced her attendance records against the midwife's registry, she found a series of names that didn't belong. There were families who had registered children with dates that would have made them school age by the time she arrived, yet those children never showed up to class. They weren't being taught at home, and they weren't dead, as their parents still lived in the county and sent their other children to school every day. She reported these findings to Horton, and he came back to the county with more questions that lacked the neat, plausible answers the first round had offered. What happened to the Anderson child, registered in November of 1879, whose parents were both alive and well? Their other children attended school, but this specific child never appeared in any county record after that initial entry in the midwife's book. What happened to the twins, reported in March of 1881, delivered to a widow named Foster, who had no children in the public record? Foster's own daughter had been there at the delivery and witnessed the birth, so she knew for a fact that 2 healthy twins had come into the world. The midwife had answers for all of it, just like she always did. But Horton had learned that her stories only made sense if you didn't ask the next question. And now he was asking it. Once Horton and Pritchard started looking for patterns, the reality of the situation became impossible to miss. The families who came to the midwife's house weren't all the same, and, more importantly, they didn't leave the same way. Families with land and standing in the community usually arrived during the day, and they made no secret of the birth because they wanted the neighbors to know. The midwife attended them and delivered their children, filling in her registry with full names and dates, and those children grew up visible to everyone. They went to school and worked their family's land, and their parents claimed them in public and in court because these births were real, and the midwife's record matched the world. The other births were different, involving families without resources who arrived under the cover of night. These were the poor women and the wives of tenant farmers whose names carried no property or standing, and they often came alone or with only a younger sister for support. They went into the midwife's house, and they came back out again, but they didn't always come back out carrying a baby. The ones who did were women who paid in advance or had something the midwife wanted, while the ones who came with nothing often left with nothing. A woman named Eleanor Voss described her own delivery in 1884 during an interview with a county historian 40 years later. She had been a tenant farmer's daughter who was unmarried at the time, so the pregnancy had been handled quietly until the midwife was finally called. Eleanor remembered walking to that house in September and recalled the cry of the baby girl immediately after birth, a sound she felt and heard as the child entered the world. Then the midwife moved between her and the child, wrapping the baby in cloth, and taking it to another room before Eleanor could even move or ask a question. When she finally asked what was happening, the midwife told her the baby was born dead and had no life in it. And Eleanor heard nothing else after that. But Eleanor knew she had heard a cry, and while her testimony never proved anything in a courtroom, it sat in the archive like a heavy stone. The midwife said the baby was born dead, but the mother insisted she heard it cry. Another case came from the court records themselves, involving a girl named Martha, born to a woman named Catherine Reeves in 1886. The midwife took the child immediately after delivery and told Catherine that a family with means had already been arranged to take the baby. She promised that this family lived 2 counties over and could feed the child properly, and since Catherine was poor and exhausted, she couldn't find the strength to argue. She signed a paper the midwife put in front of her, and the baby was gone before Catherine was even fully conscious again. When Catherine tried to find the child years later, she had no name to search for, and no legal claim to the daughter she remembered. The official records showed the birth and the mother's signature, but the child wasn't listed as being placed anywhere in the state. The child had been born, registered, and then completely erased. The midwife's defense was simple enough that it almost sounded reasonable when she finally gave it. She claimed she was preventing suffering because these women had no way to care for infants, and she believed the children would have died of neglect or poverty otherwise. She argued that she was performing a service by placing them with families who had resources and actually wanted them, and in her mind, she was being merciful. What she was describing wasn't adoption, though, because real adoption requires consent and paperwork and the knowledge of where a child is going. What she was doing was erasure with a form of permission that a poor woman with no legal standing couldn't possibly refuse. These mothers had a choice, the same way a tenant farmer has a choice about which crop to plant, meaning they could do what was offered, or they could suffer the consequences. The real revelation didn't come until investigators finally tore into her house with a level of detail they hadn't used before. They weren't just looking for paperwork anymore, because by this point, they were hunting for physical evidence of what had actually happened inside those 4 walls. The first ledger, the one she'd shown to Judge Horton and entered into the official county records, was a model of formal bookkeeping. It listed birth dates and mothers' names in clean, professional entries that made it look like every delivery was witnessed and above board. It was a public document designed for a magistrate to inspect without asking questions. But when the authorities ripped open the walls and pried up the floorboards during their search, they pulled out a second ledger that told a much darker story. This book was smaller than the first one, bound in a leather cover that had faded to the color of old, dried blood. While the handwriting matched the official records, the entries were written in a cryptic shorthand that the public was never meant to see. You still saw birth dates and mothers' names, but beside each entry sat a notation that turned a medical record into a bill of sale. Words like placed, settled, or debt paid filled the margins, and some entries even listed labor collateral as the status of the child. She wasn't just recording the arrival of new lives into the world. She was keeping a detailed inventory of human transactions. The ledger read like a merchant's account book, where the primary trade was human life itself. If a baby was born to a woman who had nothing to her name, that child was recorded as payment for a debt, or collateral for a loan. Another entry might be marked as settled, which meant the deal was done and the record was closed for good. The names of the mothers only showed up once at the moment of delivery, while the children didn't have names at all. They existed in her book the same way a shipment of grain exists in a warehouse, marked as received, transferred, or closed out. Some of these notes mentioned names that didn't belong to the mothers, pointing instead to a network of other women. Some of them had training as nurses or midwives, while others were just locals who were willing to help for a price. They appeared in the ledger as assistants, or keepers, proving that this wasn't some accidental operation she was running by herself. She had at least 6 other women working under her to manage the infants passing through the house and preparing them for the families she'd already lined up. When investigators began matching these hidden entries to records in the surrounding area, they found that some of these children had actually been folded into official records elsewhere. Scattered birth certificates turned up in 3 neighboring counties under completely different names, with no link to their biological mothers. A girl born to Eleanor Voss was found 70 miles south, legally registered to a merchant family who claimed they'd hired her as an apprentice the day she was born. A boy born to Catherine Reeves turned up in a cotton mill town with a fake surname and a note saying his parents were unknown. But the vast majority of these children simply vanished into thin air. The ledger held about 127 names, yet investigators could only find a paper trail for maybe 40 of them in the entire state. The rest left no forward records, no small graves in the local cemeteries, and no apprenticeship papers or school enrollments. There was absolutely no evidence that they had survived more than a few days past their birth in that house. The search of the house eventually provided a grim explanation for how she managed so many infants at once. The cellar was a small, damp room with a dirt floor that had never been packed down, and 4 crude cradles made of lashed branches were lined up against the cold wall. Dried milk stains still covered the wood, and a rotted leather harness used to strap a baby to a traveler's chest hung from a peg. There were no name tags or toys, just pottery bottles and strips of torn cloth that suggested a high-speed operation where babies were held briefly before being moved along. The question shifted from what happened to these children to a much more uncomfortable inquiry about who else was involved. The other women in the ledger clearly knew what was happening, as did the families who paid for the children, and the judge who protected her practice. The sheriff and the local doctors must have seen the discrepancies, yet they all stayed silent for nearly 15 years. It took a massive web of complicity for a business like this to thrive in the middle of a small community without anyone stepping in to stop it. Prosecuting the midwife should have been an open and shut case, because the hidden ledger provided the documentation, and the public registry proved the fraud. The fact that dozens of children were missing pointed directly to a criminal conspiracy. However, the law in 1889 didn't work with that kind of logic, especially in a rural county where the legal system was built on the same shaky foundations that let her operate in the first place. Midwifery wasn't a licensed profession back then, so there were no rules about who could deliver a baby or what happened to the child afterward. The state wanted records, but they didn't have anyone to actually check if those records were true once they were filed at the courthouse. A midwife's word was the law when it came to establishing a birth, which meant she was the only authority the state recognized. To prosecute her, the state had to prove she'd abused a power that technically didn't even exist under the law. The trial finally started in the spring of 1890, and the courtroom was packed with a jury of local men who knew exactly what was at stake for the community. 3 of those men had actually hired her themselves in the past. The prosecutor laid out the ledgers and called Eleanor Voss to the stand, even though her testimony was mostly based on what she'd heard rather than what she could physically prove. He showed the schoolteacher's records that highlighted the massive gaps between the number of births registered and the number of children who actually showed up for class. Physicians from the next county over testified that they'd never seen the children listed in her books. It was a case that should have been airtight, using her own handwriting to prove she was lying about every birth and death in that house. The defense didn't even try to deny that the ledgers existed, because there was no way to hide them. Instead, they argued that the private book was just a collection of personal notes from a busy woman trying to keep track of complicated favors in a frontier town. They claimed the public registry was the only one that mattered, and that any missing children were simply the result of the high infant mortality rates of the time. The schoolteacher's records were dismissed as proof of nothing more than families moving away or choosing to keep their kids home to work the farm. Then the defense made an argument that really hit home with the local crowd. by claiming she was being punished for a service the community had actually asked for. Every wealthy family that used her knew the deal, and they understood that some children were placed elsewhere as part of a private agreement. The mothers had signed the papers and taken whatever payment they could get. So the defense asked why this woman should go to prison for doing exactly what the county had hired her to do. Testimony from the town's elite families only made the prosecutor's job harder. They stood up in court and admitted she had delivered their children, who were all healthy and visible in the community, and they praised her for her absolute discretion. One man even admitted he'd paid her with a plot of land, which matched the entry in her secret ledger, but he insisted the deal was fair and fully understood by everyone involved. It was clear that her competence and her ability to keep a secret were the very reasons these people had trusted her for over a decade. The poor families who had lost their children didn't have the same impact on the stand. Their words didn't carry much weight because they had no money, no land, and no social standing that would make a jury believe them over a woman with documented records. As the trial went on, the prosecutor realized he wasn't just fighting one woman, but the entire county's history of looking the other way. The judge who had helped her get her start took the stand, and the sheriff had to admit he'd known about the missing children for years. Even the local doctor admitted he'd heard the rumors, but didn't think it was his business to interfere with a midwife's work. The very people who were supposed to be the gatekeepers of justice had been the ones holding the gate open for her. In the end, she wasn't convicted of kidnapping or anything related to the missing children. She was found guilty of the much smaller charges of falsifying vital records and practicing medicine without a license. These were safe convictions that didn't require the town to look too closely at its own sins. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but she only served 3 before she was released for good behavior and disappeared back into the hills. When she walked out of prison in 1893, the historical record simply went quiet. No one can say with any real certainty where she went or what she did once she was free. Local stories place her a few counties over within a few years, working under a different name and delivering babies for poor families who had never heard her story and likely wouldn't have cared if they had. Other accounts suggest she fled the state entirely to escape her reputation, but what remains clear is that she didn't stay where people knew her name or where those ledgers were kept. The children she had funneled through her network were already scattered across the state and far beyond its borders. Some of them had been lucky enough to find stable families who took them in and raised them with genuine care. Those children grew up never knowing they had been born into a cold financial transaction, and their parents told them they were adopted or found or given freely by a mother who couldn't keep them. They built lives and had their own children, never suspecting that a hidden ledger somewhere contained their true names and a price tag. But not every child was so fortunate in the homes they were sent to. Some were placed with families who saw them as servants rather than children, and these boys and girls were often working in the fields or the kitchen long before they ever saw the inside of a schoolhouse. Some were even handed over to mill owners as cheap labor before they were old enough to work legally under the law. They were passed from family to family like borrowed property, with each transition marked in a private note, but never in an official record, leaving them to move through childhood without ever truly belonging anywhere. Decades later, women began to come forward with fragmented stories that didn't quite add up. They spoke of being told their names were different, or that their birth families had died, or that they owed a lifelong debt to the people who had kept them. They had never seen a birth certificate and had no way to prove who they actually were. These testimonies didn't usually make it into the newspapers, but they showed up in letters to county historians and in whispered family secrets that contradicted everything the official records claimed. The hidden ledger became evidence in legal battles the midwife never could have anticipated once it was finally discovered and preserved. It surfaced in inheritance disputes, paternity cases, and custody battles that took place decades after the original transactions had been settled. A woman in her 30s might track down the book only to find her name next to a notation that read, 3 acres paid, forcing her to realize she had been born as collateral for a land deal. Another might find her birth recorded, but her name changed and filed under a different family, leaving the ledger as the only proof that her original story ever existed. As local historians began collecting these cases, they realized the midwife story was less of an outlier and something far more sinister. Similar practices were happening all across rural Georgia, and nearly identical ledgers began turning up in other counties. Not all of them were run by midwives, and not all of them were focused on the act of birth, but the underlying principle remained the same. It was a system built for women without power and children without advocates, designed to move the vulnerable from one hand to another, without any oversight from the law. This wasn't just one corrupt woman. It was a frontier economy that treated human beings as liquid assets. The midwife's name eventually became a symbol for something much larger than her own individual crimes. What she did wasn't a freak occurrence, but rather an extreme version of what the system at the time allowed to happen. She had simply been more organized and more deliberate than the others, and she was willing to document her work when she could have just as easily kept her mouth shut. Maybe that was an act of mercy for the children. Or maybe it was just her own professional arrogance. But either way, the ledger survived to tell the tale. The leather ledger still exists today. It is kept in a climate-controlled archive in northern Georgia, and, if you have a good enough reason, the archivists might let you see it. The pages have grown fragile over the years, and the handwriting is starting to fade in the margins, but the entries themselves are still perfectly legible. You can see the 127 names and the 127 births that represent lives someone, somewhere, tried to turn into a business. The children born in that house are all adults now, or they have already passed away. Most of them lived and died without ever learning the truth of their own beginnings, carrying a debt they didn't even know they owed. A few lucky ones found their names in the ledger and managed to trace their way back to their mothers. Many others simply disappeared into the lives they were handed, never knowing where they came from or why they were given away. The midwife's name still survives in the region, but she isn't remembered as a healer. She is remembered as a warning. Some debts are written down in ink, some are buried in the dirt, and some are carried by people who never knew they were part of the deal. Subscribe for more stories of the women history forgot and the heavy price they were forced to pay.